Hello everyone, this is part 2 of preparing your NSX hosts. If you haven't seen part 1 where we talk about definitions and VTEPs and transport zones, you're going to want to check that out. But this one here, I'm just going to go through and start demoing. So stick around and I'll be right back. Thanks. Okay, everybody, we are back. This is going to be part 2 of preparing your hosts. Again, if you haven't gone through that part 1, and if you're not familiar with what a VTEP is, an overlay network, you're going to want to see that first, okay? But anyways, let's jump right into it. Let's do the demo. I'm logged into my NSX environment. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go in. First of all, I'm going to create my transport zone. Then I'm going to create an IP pool for my taps. All right. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to go into Fabric here. So I'm under System. I'm going to go into Fabric, and then under Transport Zones, I'm going to click on Transport Zones. Now you'll see that there are some that are already created for me. This comes out of the box just like that. So you'll see there's an NSX Overlay Transport Zone, and the type is Overlay. It's not being used anywhere, and you'll see there's an NSX VLAN transport zone, and it's a VLAN type. And I talked a little bit about what those are in part 1, so check that out if you haven't already done so. Now, I could use these. Nothing wrong with me using these, or I can create my own. Totally up to you, okay? I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna delete these. If you're not gonna use them and you're gonna create your own, I would suggest you delete them. This way you don't get confused down the road, because it's very easy to accidentally select the wrong transport zone, then communication doesn't work. So I'm going to add my own in. I'm going to call it prod-overlay-tz for transport zone. This is the ones that we actually use. Oh, I got my caps lock on. Let's fix that. Prod-overlay-transport zone. And it's, again, you can give it the description. It could be an overlay or VLAN. This is an overlay. I'll talk about NIC teaming. I talked about NIC teaming in the first part. I'll show you where this kind of come into play a little bit later. So I'm just going to say add this. I just created a transport zone. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to add a VLAN transport zone. I'm not going to use that one right now, but when you watch the routing videos, you'll see that get used there. So I'm going to say prod-VLAN-TZ for transport zone. Call it whatever you want. I'm going to say VLAN here. You want to maybe, I wouldn't call it transport zone 1 and transport zone 2, because that tells me nothing about it, right? You want something in the name that kind of makes sense. So all that should be designed beforehand. So when I go add on this one, I can tell right off the bat that that first one's an overlay, because I named it with the overlay in it, and the other one is VLAN. So call it whatever is appropriate in your environment, but make it make sense and nothing silly like transport zone 1, transport zone 2. Now, what I want to do is, before we start preparing our host, I want to decide how I'm going to assign my VTEP IPs. And in my example, I'm actually going to use an IP pool. You could use DHCP if you wanted to, but I'm going to do an IP pool here. So let me go into, I always forget where this one is. I think it's under, I always forget, it's inventory. No, it's under networking. Under networking, IP addresses, I'm going to click on that, and then I can add in an IP address pool if I want to here. So I'm going to click on add IP pool. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it VTEP-pool. These are going to be a pool of addresses for my VTEPs. I'm going to click over here on the set under subnets, and I'm going to click on add a subnet, and I can do a block or I can do a range. I'm just going to pick a range. It depends on what you want in your environment. Under your IP ranges here, so let me type this in. I'm going to type in 172. What's my tap range? 20.11.151 to 172.20.11.170. This is actually the ranges I use in my classroom. That's why I use those. You can use whatever's appropriate for your environment. My CIDR is 172.20.11.0. 0/24. My DNS server is going to be the same. Technically, I don't even need to put that in. It doesn't require DNS, but it does need a gateway quite possibly. So I'm going to go to 172.20.11.10, and that's all I really need. I'll go add, and then I'll go apply, and then I go save. Okay, a lot of clicking here. So great, created my transport zones, created my tap pool. Now I can start preparing my host. I go under system. Now under fabric, this is actually a change in 4.1. In 4.1, and they added this here, hosts. Before, all you would see normally is just nodes, and then you would go in and add in as a node, as a transport node, right? But under here now, it just talks about edges. We'll talk about edges when I get into routing, okay? But under hosts over here, this is where you can actually configure a cluster if you want, or a standalone. So actually, a standalone would basically be like a bare metal box, okay, running Windows or Linux. Now, a couple of things I need to do before I go and prepare my hosts over here. So here you see it found my cluster. How did it find it? It's because I registered my vCenter server as a compute manager. So it knows what I have. I have 3 nodes in my cluster, right? I could select a node and configure that node if I wanted to individually, okay? Now, before I do that, we're going to be utilizing my vSphere distributed switch. I got to make a change there. So I'm going to go into my vCenter server. I'm going to go in my networking view. I'm going to right click on my distributed switch. See, it says here site A VDS01. And I'm just going to basically go into, where are you, settings, edit settings. And then under advanced is where we're going to change my MTU size. Okay. So you got to, right now it's defaulting at 1500 MTU or 1500 bytes. So I'm going to change mine just in my lab environment to 1700. And I'm going to say OK. All right. Now you would set that to whatever your physical environment is. Okay. So I'm going to leave that there, and then I'm going to go back into NSX. Now I'm going to show you a couple ways you can do this. I can prepare a host one at a time if I want. Now, before I do that, let me show you something. Let's go to profiles here. And this talks about your teaming profiles. You'll see there's a bunch of default ones here. The NSX default load balanced. So a teaming policy is load balanced based on the source port. And then the uplinks is uplinks 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that means you would actually have a distributed switch with 4 uplinks. Okay. The other default one is default uplink host profile, failover order, and uplink 1 and uplink 1's active and uplink 2 is standby. So these are default ones. You could use these if you want to. Then there's other ones here for edges. I'm going to leave those alone. We'll talk about edges when I get into routing. Now, if I don't like any of these, I can actually pick and I can actually create my own if I wanted to, right? So let me go in and create. Let's create. I'm going to create 2 just so you can kind of see the difference. I'm going to go add profile. I'll call it Steve's profile. Call it something that makes sense, not Steve's profile. I'll do lags later. Now the teaming over here, I'm going to do failover order. All right. And I could actually edit that if I wanted to and say, no, I don't want failover order. And I talked about this in part 1. I want to do load balance based on source port or load balance based on source MAC. I'm going to say failover order, and my active uplink will be, now you just give it a name. You call the uplink what you want to call it. I'm going to call it Batman. This is my active. And Robin is my standby. These are really silly names, but I'm just showing you I could do that. So I'm just going to add. Okay. So I just created Steve's profile. It's a really silly profile just to show you that. Let's add in an LACP one, just another silly one. Steve's LACP, just so I know it's that. I'm going to go and add a lag. I'm going to give it a name. Lag. I don't got much of imagination. What LACP mode do I want? Active or passive? Again, you have to talk with your network folks on this one. What teaming algorithm are you using, or hashing for your LACP? There's a whole whack load of them here. Okay, so you pick, again, your network folks would have to configure this, and it's got to match your hardware. How many uplinks is this lag going to have? I'm just going to leave it at 2, and your timeout as well. Again, your network team is going to have to know this. Okay, now down into here, there's my lag, and then failover. I'm going to pick failover order, and I'm going to say my active uplink is lag 1. Oh, sorry, I'll call it uplink 1, U1, standby will be U2, and I'm just going to add that. There we go. So I just created my own profiles. Now let's go prepare a host. So I'm going to click on host here. Previous to 4.1, you would go into nodes and then add a node. Okay, so they changed the interface up here in 4.1. So this is 4.1. I'm going to pick my cluster, and I'm going to pick an individual host. Okay, I'm going to click on that. So I'm going to say configure NSX, and it asks me what's the name. I can give it tags and scopes. We'll talk about that when we get into security. I'm going to leave that. Now it's talking about preparing the host, right? So it says no host switch defined. So I have to basically click on add a host switch. Now it's asking me to select a vSphere distributed switch. Okay, we got rid of support for NSX distributed switches on ESXi hosts. So that used to be an option before. Now it's gone. So I'm going to pick my vSphere distributed switch. What transport zone? This host can be part of overlay and VLAN, but this host is not going to have any edges that's going to be doing routing for me. So this is just going to be compute. So I'm just going to pick my overlay, and I'll talk about routing when I get there. So I'll pick overlay. So I'm saying this guy's part of the overlay. What uplink profile do I want? Again, I can pick the default host. Remember, you see those ones I just created there? I'll say default host uplink, and then you'll see it says uplink 1, uplink 2, and then what uplink on my distributed switch do I want to link this to? So my distributed switch in vSphere, let's right click, settings, edit settings. It has 4 uplinks. Okay, I assigned uplinks 1 and uplinks 2 to all my other port groups like vMotion and all that. Uplinks 3 and 4, I have them unused, so I'm going to use those for NSX. I'm going to cancel this. All right. So it's asking me what do I want uplink 1. In this case would be my active. I'm going to say uplink 3. And what do I want for my uplink 2 from NSX? I'm going to use the distributed switch uplink 4. And that would be mapped to my physical cards on in my host. In this case, it would be uplink 3 is going to VMNIC 2, yeah, and uplink 4 on the distributed switch is going to VMNIC 3. Okay, that's all vSphere stuff. And I can say, and how do I want to assign IP addresses? DHCP, IP pool, or static list? I'm going to say IP pool here, and here's my VTAP. Now, I can actually at this point say add, and it will go in and prepare this host, right? I don't want to do that right now. I'm going to actually, pick a different profile here. Let's see what happens. I can pick Steve's silly profile. And then notice over here, uplink Batman, what am I going there, right? So remember I told you the names of the uplinks? You call it whatever you want in the profile, but it'd be probably good to call it uplink 1 and uplink 2 or whatever, but something that makes sense. So there we go. Let's look at the LACP one. I'm not going to do this. LACP. Notice this is lag 0, lag 1, right? Okay. I can actually I should have just probably picked the lag 0, say here, and then over here for my uplink 4 type of thing. Okay. But I'm going to cancel this. I don't want to prepare this host. And the reason why I don't want to prepare it, I want to show you an easier way, because if I do that, I'd have to go in and compare each host manually, right? So let me go back into cancel, and yes. I'd like to prepare the whole cluster. That makes sense, right? So let me get rid of this. Let me select my cluster, okay? And I'm going to say configure NSX. It's going to give me a kind of an error. Transport no profile. There is none. So I can create a profile with transport no profile right here that I could apply to at a cluster level. So if I got 10 hosts in there, I don't have to configure each host one at a time. I can actually just use a profile and say, here, configure that cluster, configure this cluster. So let's pick the transport. I'm going to create one. I'm going to call it ESXi profiles, whatever. Call it something that makes sense. Host switch. Think of this as a template. So I'm going to add my host switch. I'll pick my vCenter server. I'll pick the distributed switch. What transport zone? I'm going to go back to the overlay. What uplink profile? I'm just going to stick with the basic active standby one, okay, from NSX. I'm not going to use any of my silly ones, right? How do I want to assign the IPs to the taps, right? I'm going to say IP pool, and I'm going to pick my VTAP pool I created, okay? Under uplink 1, I'm going to pick my uplink 3. So that's going to be mapped to a network card on my host, and then uplink 4. Okay. Under advanced, what type of mode do we want? Now, when I hit here, you got enhanced data path standard, enhanced data path performance. They talk a little bit about it over here, but you need what's called enhanced data path drivers for these. It's the DPDK. So I'm just going to stick with the standard So you want to see if your hardware supports your DBDK. You can also go with the enhanced data path, which is kind of a software driven one. I'm just going to stick with the standard just for this demo. Okay, and I'm going to say add and then apply. I'm just creating a profile. That's all I'm doing, and I'm going to save it. I just created my profile. Let's go into my cluster now, and I'm going to say configure NSX. Now I got my transport node profile, and I'll say save. Okay, there we go, and it's actually now going through configuring it. So I just hit the refresh. See, it's configuring. This doesn't dynamically refresh. So now this is the part you want to have patience. Okay, you want to have patience here on this. I'm just going to open this up here. So all this interface has changed a bit in 4.1. So you'll actually see it's installing, right? And we'll take it from there, what it is. So I'm going to let this go for a bit. Now this is the part where you just get up and walk away. Don't be clicking here and clicking there and doing this and doing that. People get themselves into trouble doing stuff like that, okay? But it's configuring. I'm just going to walk away. I'm going to leave it alone. I'll probably speed this up for you folks, and we'll see what happens at the end, okay? Well, everybody, looks like it installed successfully. So we see we have our ESXi 0302 and 01. Everything's successfully installed. I can click on, let's go on 01. I can click on view details. And again, we see, again, it just came up. So controller connectivity, manager, configuration, and enhanced data path capable. It looks like it is capable here for that. Under monitoring, again, we again, there's, it just finished, so again, some of the stuff's not showing up, so we'll come back and take a look at that later on, right? And again, it's showing us physical adapters. Things are still kind of probably flushing itself out, so I'm just going to close this down, and we'll kind of wait a little while. But notice over here, again, we see our TEP IP. This is one of the things I wanted to point out to you. Is I'll let the other stuff refresh after a while, but ESXi01 has a 172.20.11.152 address. This one has a 153. This one has a 151 address. So those are the TEP IPs that were pulled from the pool. What did it do under the covers on vSphere? Let's go into vSphere. So we're just remember this address. Let's say, okay, yeah, 172.20.11.15 something, right? So let's go into vSphere. Let's go into hosts and clusters. I'm going to go to my first host here, ESXi01. I'm going to go to configure. I'm going to go to VM kernel adapters, and notice right off the bat, right, this host has a VM kernel 0, 1, and 2. Again, VM kernel 0 is your management. It's got a vSAN, it's got a vMotion. I set all that stuff up. So that has nothing to do with NSX. But we see VM kernel 10. Notice it says NSX overlay, right? There's the address, 172.20.11.152. Again, interesting here, says a TCP stack. All the other ones have default, and we have a separate stack for the NSX overlay as well. So some of you may be familiar with this. We can actually use the default IP stack for your vMotion and your management and all that, but sometimes you may want to separate them out. One for performance, possibly stability, because it's a separate stack. And another reason, maybe for like, well, my management network is on one subnet, my vMotion's on another, and using different gateways, right? So then you would definitely need a different stack. Same kind of thing here with our TEPs. Here is our TEP, VM kernel 10. That is the TEP. Now, notice I only have one address. Why is that? I've got two NICs. Why did I only get one? Because I picked that default failover teaming algorithm where one NIC is active, the other is standby. This is why I only have one TEP IP. If I had select something like source port or source MAC as my teaming under the networking profile, again, I had two NICs. I would see a VM kernel 10 here, and I'd see a VM kernel 11 here. Okay, so just a little FYI. The VM kernel 50, what the heck is that? And and it's called the NSX Hyperbus. That's for containers, like container networking and stuff, right? So, and again, if I look at host 2, you'll see the same similar stuff in host 3. So that's basically about it. Let's go back to NSX here and see. Again, we'll talk about troubleshooting and stuff like that a little bit later on. But again, we see we got some stuff over here. Again, this interface has actually been cleaned up a fair amount since the original versions. I'll let this thing just kind of run. Mine's not the quickest environment, but anyways, again, so there we go. We basically have our host nodes have been prepared. Okay. The next thing that'll be up, we'll talk about how do we create segments. That'll be the next video that we'll be doing. So you want to stay tuned for that. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching the end. Please subscribe to the channel. Again, if you're getting benefits from this, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me develop content. And again, if you liked it, hit that thumbs up, okay? Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. Bye now.